I'm very interested in abstract ideas that cause conflicts in logic or
Yeah.
things that we didn't think could exist.
Right,
Um,
right.
that's something that I'm interested in. So I like creating. Well, what I try to do, a lot of what I try to do is I try to make music that will cause people to disagree about its intent. Because that I guess if you get people to do that, it means that it challenges a lot of their assumptions, and maybe it challenges them to hear something new. So
Sure,
I
sure.
feel so I feel like microtonality has to be a part of that now. But a lot of the reason, unfortunately, I think that a lot of the things I do are actually, just as predictable as anything. Maybe predictability is a matter of degree, but I feel
Right,
like since
right.
since we all stand on the shoulders of giants, we also have this situation where anything postmodern, or at least anything that is trying to break from the past, is relying just as much on what has come before than anyone who's building off of tradition to write something.
Right,
So
right.
that's one reason that I'm interested in kind of like avoiding any particular school of thought, but even that
Sure.
thought itself lends itself to being in schools of thought. It's really really cool in music how if you have an X and not X, and you try to do not X, it kind of
Yeah.
becomes like X. So there are all these cool situations where if you try to break a binary logic, you come up with some really cool stuff. Like if you've got something that sounds pretty ordered and something that sounds pretty random. Again, we're being very very unspecific, but let's be stereotypical about it. We've got something that doesn't sound random, and we have something that does sound random.
Whoa. Yeah,
Well,
right.
something that doesn't is something that sounds random now doesn't sound random because it has established its character of randomness.
Right, yeah, exactly. So something that I think is really interesting about that is the object itself is still truly random, right? We just prescribe an order to it, right? Like once the randomized like item gets presented, it's still random, but we now perceive that pattern, or we perceive a pattern out of that randomized thing now.
Yeah.
And like that now, like you said, takes this quality of not being random anymore. Even though it truly is generated from a random process or whatever, it truly is a random thing, right? But
Yeah.
what's that? It's like is it like the something in like quantum physics or whatever? Like just by observing it, it changes the properties of that thing. That's
Yes,
kind
that's
of
called
like what I'm.
superposition.
I'm sorry.
Yes, that's called superposition.
Yes, yeah, right. Uh, yeah, man. Well, okay. So I guess with that in mind, I'm going to start recording here for a second, or not for a second,
Okay.
for the entirety of the thing. And
Oh, awesome. I'm excited. And I love talking about things that are random because I guess because of studying music, I've really figured out how many things random means. Because
right,
in music, I guess the two implications for this tend to be, well, if something sounds random, it sounds like that might not be from any particular collection. This goes back to us talking about diatonic earlier, or in a microtonal space where no diatonic scales are available,
right.
albatonic versus chromatic. You select a particular mode and you use those notes, and then maybe you can use some other notes to color that in creative ways and stuff like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's all very like a lot of the logic breaks down really quickly once you get microtonal. But for something,
yeah, right.
for something to sound random, like in terms of what the pitch collections and what the rhythms are, you know, that's way way different than using random procedures to come up with a piece. In fact, I'd be really
Right.
interested in coming up with a piece that's so random that it has no internal character whatsoever and sounds extremely extremely different every time, where the instruments are all vastly different and nothing is ever the same. I'm very interested in that as an idea. I'm just kind of like, because I know John Cage, like he does that more than anybody.
Right.
In order to do that as a composer, I think you have to not be scared to like let go that
Exactly.
control and the personality that you put into the piece. And the way you come up with that sort of is more indicative of your character than what the piece itself actually says.
Right.
Which
I
is really
agree with that.
social component.
Well, since we've kind of started this, hello everyone. This is Stephen Weigel. For those of you that are still with us, we definitely are talking about modern music.
Oh yeah.
I guess a brief rundown of Stephen. If you watched the music theory thing that we did, I guess it was last week, a couple weeks ago. Anyway, Steven and I first met at Charlotte New Music Festival. There we go. I was about to say University of Charlotte, but it's like, wait a second, that doesn't sound anything like where we met. But it was the Charlotte New Music Festival. It was the University of North Carolina, right? Greensboro, North Carolina, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Anyway, so I met Steven about 3 years ago there, and we've kind of kept in touch since. And today, we're just going to talk about modern music and kind of how, where it comes from and its evolution from romantic into this modern 20th century idea. So like I said, we've kind of been discussing this stuff a little bit already. Steven himself is probably one of 3 people that I know that like truly understand microtonality. Most people, when I like talk to them about these like microtonal concepts, I feel like they have like read a Wikipedia article about it or something, and in which case I can have a conversation with them, right? Because that's the extent of my knowledge. However, like, so it's you and Ian really are the 2 people that I know that are like really in it. And then there was another friend of mine from grad school that I kind of lost contact with, who was really into these ideas. But, whenever you guys start talking about some of this stuff, it just goes beyond me, man. I find it extremely interesting, and I want to learn more about it. That's why I keep coming back to you. But, like, I'm not going to lie. Some of it is just way above me. And maybe, like, one day I'll be able to grasp it.
Yeah.
But, so today, I do know that, like, for you, microtones are a big part of your compositional style, and they have a sort of an effect, I guess, on the way that you write your music. Could you go maybe a little bit into sort of the history of microtonality, just very briefly, if that's even possible?
I can try. Well, I guess yes, history of microtonality. So 12-tone equal temperament is a recent invention. It's kind of like the technology and the computers we're using, where in terms of human history, it's just this little tiny slice, which is fine because there's a lot of that sound like 12-tone equal temperament, or it creates similar affect. So really, 12-tone equal temperament has come about because from a manufacturing and technical perspective, it's an extremely efficient way to play major and minor chords sort of under one hand in both ways. So it really came out of keyboard practice, I think. And it's sort of evolved that way out of European tradition. So that's where 12-tone equal temperament comes from. Now that we define microtonal tuning systems as different from 12-tone equal temperament, well, that can be a result of many different kinds of schools of thought. One particular school of thought would be, or schools, I guess, is music that's thoroughly non-European probably uses a tuning system that's not 12-tone equal temperament. It might sound like 12-tone equal temperament in the case of some Indian music. It might not in the case of like some Makam music, gamelan music, African music. There's lots of music that doesn't sound like it's in 12-tone equal temperament. That just comes from non-European culture. There's also another school of thought that is sort of contrarian or slightly derivative of 12-tone equal temperament. That is, and this is sort of where I come from, is I've observed that 12-tone equal temperament is the dominant culture because all of the tools that we use to play music are built in it, and its assumptions are baked into everything we do. So one of my goals as a Zen harmonic person is to challenge those assumptions for many reasons. One of them being because I'm interested in just exploring new sounds. So I guess that's kind of a history. That's sort of where it comes from. You should know that the word microtonal is a little bit weird because people use microtones for different things. So microtonal has kind of become this objective word for the usage of tuning systems that's not in 12-tone equal temperament. And then Zen harmonic has become a word saying, oh, we want music that doesn't sound like it's in 12-tone equal temperament at all. And that's why we're using it. So then under the Zen harmonic definition, certain European songs and things written in older tuning systems that would accomplish what 12 equal does would not be considered Zen harmonic. Certain Indian ragas might not be considered Zen harmonic, things like that. So
interesting.
Hopefully that was okay.
Yeah, no, perfect. So one thing that you mentioned though is that these sort of non-Western traditions tend to use a lot more microtonality. And one of the ensembles that you kind of talked about was a gamelan orchestra or a gamelan ensemble.
Yes.
Now, in my class, we always talk about Debussy, right? He's sort of one of our bridge figures from this Romantic into the modern era.
Yeah.
And we talk about his first experience with a gamelan orchestra. Was it the 1880 something World Fair? I can't quite remember when. It was the first World Fair, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It was the one that they built. They built the tower. Wow. Eiffel Tower. There we go. It's the one that they built. They built the Eiffel Tower, I think, specifically for this festival or something like that. And so Debussy goes to this festival and he's seeing all this stuff, crazy things that people had never seen, and he hears this ensemble, the Gamelan Orchestra, right? Something that he had never heard before. And I imagine that a lot of people at this fair had never heard anything like this. And, you know, to try to describe the sound of a gamelan orchestra is challenging, to say the least. But something that I think is really interesting, and it's interesting that you brought that up too, is whenever you were playing your, is it the 19 keyboard?
Yes, it's currently formatted in 19.
Right. There it is. So whenever you were playing some of these, so you were playing the 19 keyboard right next to the 12-tone keyboard, right? And sort of doing some of
I've
these
got another one over here. Yeah.
Right. So you have a 12-tone equal tempered keyboard over there, and then a 19 EDO keyboard on the other side of you. And when you were playing these, like you were doing we were going around the circle of fifths, and it honestly sounded. Yeah, do it right now. Actually, why not?
Okay, here we go. By the way, 19-tone equal tempered fifths are comfortably flat. So they're flat enough to count as perfect fifths, but similarly to how 12-tone equal tempered major third is like slightly out of tune enough to be annoying, 19-tone equal temperament's perfect fifth is slightly out of tune enough to be annoying. So there's kind of a swap going on. 19-tone's got better thirds, 12-tone has way better fifths. So here's what happens if we stack fifths. What I'll do is I'll play, starting from C, I'll play C, G, D, A, but I'm just going to play them in both 19 and 12, echoing each other, and I'll play starting with the 19 so that you can hear how it drifts over time. You see? So by the time we hit E sharp in 19-tone equal temperament, that's enharmonic to F flat in that system. But in 12-tone equal temperament, it's enharmonic to F. So here's F from 12 and E sharp from 19, which is also F flat. I can do them at the same time too if you want. It's very dissonant, but kind of fun.
Yeah, no, I think it would be good to hear. Let's hear it at the same time. Yeah.
Same time, yeah. You'll hear that they slowly drift apart.
Drift, yeah. It's crazy. Yeah.
That's Zen harmonics in a nutshell right there.
Right, if you can go ahead and play that.
No, sorry.
There it is. Oh man, that's hard to listen to, but it's so interesting, you know? And whenever you were doing that the very first time, the first thing I thought of was like, oh, this kind of sounds like a gamelan orchestra. And like, one of the weird phenomenons about just music in general is like, you know, the more instruments you have playing the same note, it's like that note isn't going to be quite in tune, but it has this weird like shimmery effect, you know? That's like why like a violin section of 20 violinists, it sounds different from just like one violinist, right? First off, I mean, there's more sound, but also like they're not all playing the exact same note. They're real close to it, like really close, but just not the exact same. And that gives it this like just a shimmer effect. And that's the only way I've ever been able to really describe it. Now with the gamelan orchestra,
like an attribute.
Yeah, exactly. With the gamelan orchestra, you know, they're basically hitting metal bars, right? Essentially, it's like all the gamelan instruments are tuned metal bars, right? But they're not all tuned the exact same way. They're kind of like sized up to be about the same length, about the same thickness, but like they're not the exact same. Whereas, for instance, an orchestral vibraphone, right? Like they're all going to be the exact same pitches, either A440 or A442. They're kind of tuned to that, right? Whereas a gamelan orchestra, one gamelan might be A440, one gamelan might be A440.5, one gamelan might be A441, you know, and it's just kind of like, just make them, look at them, they sound pretty good. And then when you play them all together, though, it's just this amazing wash of sound. Sorry, you going to say something?
Yes, we should, this is a really, really good thing to talk about. We should make a distinction between regional tunings that are intentionally slightly apart to cause beating sensations and different tuning systems in different regions of Indonesia. So, you know, because if you have a gamelan scale, the two gamelan scales that are used are Slendro and Pelog. And Pelog can sometimes be theorized as a scale that has 2 large steps and 5 small steps, or something close to 9 or 16 tone-equal temperament, maybe a subset of that. But they can be very different. They don't all have to be that. That's just like an abstraction that we can take from it if we wanted to get something Pelog-like that might not do justice to a particular way of playing. But yeah, individual gamelan instruments in the same ensemble might be tuned slightly apart, so they have that beating sensation.
Right. Yeah.
But if it's done with metallic instruments, instead of it, you know, sort of feeling like fingernails on a chalkboard, it feels like this pleasant, delightful shimmering that comes from just kind of the metallic nature of it. And tuning those things apart is different from a gamelan in a different village that tunes their Slendro scale so differently that the step sizes themselves of the Slendro wouldn't really be considered to match the ones in like village A. I don't know any of the geography, but I know that like regional ensembles tune differently, and it can be so different that things can be, you know, over a semitone and a half on particular notes. But I don't know how that evolved. Perhaps it was a situation similar to like, you know, the Baroque era where people have different standards as they kind of spread farther apart. And so the regions kind of influence each other. Maybe if you're farther away, you've got a more distant tuning than if you're closer.
Right. Because I was actually about to say that, you know, it's almost like this sounds a lot like the way that you know, they tuned ensembles and instruments in the Baroque era, you know, and there wasn't like a set way of tuning. They just kind of were like, it sounds good. Let's go from there. And you know, it's really interesting how, like, you know, I mean, clearly there's like a lot more involved. There was a lot more math involved in it sounds good, right? Because like, you know, the Greeks figured out that strings make sound, and like you can divide those strings in equal lengths to create different types of sounds, you know? So I mean, they're kind of working with that concept of taking a note and then being able to divide that note into different equal sort of pitches between the notes, you know? So, you know, Debussy is like the first guy to kind of hear this stuff. And, you know, as a guy who didn't really care about theory to begin with, he just was really interested in like sound. That had to have been like mind blowing, you know, like, what is this music that I have never heard before in my life? And I don't know, I can't even fathom like hearing some of that stuff for the first time. Well, I mean, I know what I did think when I heard it the first time. I was blown away. Like I didn't know music could sound like this, you know, like what are these sounds, right? It was the first time that I thought in terms of sounds, right? And not like what notes they were playing, you know, it's just like, what is this sound, right?
Yeah.
And
beautiful.
And that seems to be like a common sort of thing amongst the 20th century composers and musicians is what sounds are we capable of achieving? You know, it's not so much pitches or notes anymore, but what sounds can we get?
Yeah, at the backbone of spectralism, really, and stuff like that. And microtonality and spectralism are kind of interwoven with each other. But I'd say that a lot of people who self-describe themselves as microtonal are fairly interested in almost like creating alternative versions of like common practice period harmony. You know how, I don't know if you do this in your appreciation class, but in the diatonic scale that we use in 12 tone equal temperament, chords have certain roles and they're very well defined, not just because that they have inherent properties that cause them to lead in certain ways, but because there's centuries of tradition to build on.
Right.
And microtonal scales don't have that benefit, especially if they're Morse harmonic. But people, I think, are interested in coming up with chord progressions that sound really, really new, but also give a sense of being ordered or having counterpoint that conforms to something that you might not be able to understand and hear right away, but that you know is very consistent.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, man. So the whole concept of like microtonality and Zen harmony, just in general, as a study, as a mode of study, I guess, seems to be fairly new as far as the academic world is considered, or the Western academic world is considered. I honestly can't speak much about like Eastern societies and whatnot, and you know, for instance, like Indian classical music is way more steeped in microtonality than like we ever will be, I think. But you know, the West, we have just a different view of music. You know, for instance, the idea of harmony, right? That's a uniquely Western concept in general. But what do you mean?
Well, I mean, there's lots of harmony in gamelan music, for one thing.
Sure. However, it's not like they're not thinking in terms of functionality like the West was.
Right.
You know, like
we've got the tonal system.
Right? Yeah, right. Exactly. And it seems to me that like harmony, as far as the East was concerned, it seems to be a byproduct of just stacking melodies on top of one another, right? Which essentially is kind of like how the West figured it out.
I've heard lots of African music that uses harmony, but it's very, very hard to find, I think, because not only are things usually in another language, but they're not accessible. Like they're not pop music, you know?
Yeah,
and
right.
The incentive is always to create things that sound like pop music. So, you know, if you want to find those really unusual things that don't conform to the whole Western scheme, then you really have to dig. It was a really, really interesting thing I found where it was this village that they had like 6 horns and they were playing a big chord that was really insane. And then like they would play the big chord and then there was like a little riff and then they played the big chord and it was like a ceremonial dance as things usually are. So I've heard lots of harmony in non-Western music. I don't know if it's not as codified as Western harmony is. We have this term, the tonal system, that we use to describe it, and we have all these rules. I don't know how deep the rules of other non-European music run.
Yeah, honestly, me neither. What I do know about sort of other cultures' music is very basic, very minimal.
It's really hard to get that information.
Yeah, that's the thing too, is like they didn't really write stuff down. It's a lot of like just an oral tradition, you know, they would just talk about it and like play it, and then you would just play that, right? You just do whatever your teachers did, and then, you know, as there was a jazz musician in Houston who once told me, this is probably the worst piece of good advice I have ever gotten in my life, or the best piece of bad advice, maybe, I don't know. But he just said, you do it long enough and it starts to make sense. And it's like, man, that's so true.
Yeah, it is. I definitely agree with that. But yeah.
So you know, we've been spent a good chunk of time so far talking about microtones, and I think one of the important things to recognize with like modern music is that composers kind of get just like bored in a way with like the what we call the common practice system, or the common practice theory. Essentially all those rules that Stephen was talking about, right? So like composers basically just get bored with all that stuff, and they try to figure out new ways to just make sounds, right? Make sounds happen. And like, you know, honestly, I think it really starts kind of with the end of the Romantics, right? Because they basically start to realize that like everything kind of reaches this point where it climaxes, right? And the climax is the most tense part of a piece of music, right? And the tension is sort of what makes music interesting, and the release of that tension, you know, that's essentially the cadential point, like the cadence, right? You build up to a tense point and then you release that tension. And it seems that like, as far as the rules were concerned, all of these composers and musicians, they just keep making the tension more tense, right? And it's like, you just make it more tense and then more tense, right? Until by the end of the Romantic era, it's like that's all it is just tension, right? Like those Wagnerian operas that are like, what, 14 hours long, and you get a tonic chord at the end of the 14th hour, you know? It's like it's insane to listen to, you know? But also, as a composer and musician, it's like, well, what do I do next? You know, like how do I take this stuff and like, where do I go with this? You know, like the rules have been exhausted, you know, like we have done literally everything we can with this rule set. Except for microtones, right? Those are still a really new concept, you know? And, you know, what's interesting about microtones too is they appear a lot more than people recognize or realize, I feel like. The idea of the blue note, right? The blue note itself is a microtonal concept. You know, we theorize it as a minor third, right? Or a sharp 4, but it's like, it really was just an out of tune third or like an out of tune 4th or 5th, you know, that they use to like get to another note, right? At least that's been my understanding of these sort of blue notes. The blue note sort of is a bridge from one to another thing, you know? And,
actually, 19-tone equal temperament is a great way to play, a great way to demonstrate the difference between a blue note and a standard note, if you'd like. Here's the normal. It might be too flat because the idea is in some minor thirds you give it a bit of a flattening,
right?
And that flattening is usually at about a 6th tone. And then there's some situations like in American pop music where there's intentional aiming at a third that isn't major minor, like right in between. I actually have a video about it on my YouTube channel, non-zenharmonic usages of microtonality in popular music.
Nice.
Which I need to update because people are doing more stuff.
Yeah, right. You know, I think that's also kind of related to, you remember that there was that whole millennial whoop thing? Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
And like, honestly, though, I think that has to be related to this whole like blue note thing, because theoretically the millennial whoop was just a minor third, right? That kind of thing. Right? Or whoa, right? But it's like all these different singers, they put different inflections on it, you know, and it really is just a blue note. They just, it's never quite in tune, right? I feel like most of it is in tune because of post-production processes that people run music through today, you know, sort of auto-tuning is like a real dangerous threat. However, like when you listen to these things live, you know, it's like, they're not quite in tune. Being quarantined, for instance, like I've had many an opportunity to watch the American Idol, for instance. And like listening to some of the way that these people sing, you know, it's like, they're not in tune, right? But it doesn't sound bad. That's the thing, right? It doesn't sound bad. They're not in tune, you know?
Some notes matter a lot less than other notes. Passing notes matter less. A note that you hold on a 5th or a tonic for a long time that signals finality matters a lot. That note can't be out of tune, and preferably it should be a hair sharp. But yeah,
better sharp than out of key. That's what I heard. I was one of the very first pit gigs I had. The music director was talking to the horns, and he just kept saying, you know, better sharp than out of key, better sharp than out of key, or out of tune, or something. Better sharp than out of tune, or something like that. And for the longest time, I was like, "What? You're the director. Why are you telling us? Like, we're students, you know? Like, you're telling us this thing. Like, I don't get it." And then, you know, I started to play music more, and the more I did it, the more it started to make sense. You know, it's just like sharp notes just sound better for some reason. Like, I don't know why.
Or at least like if you have chords and your you know, intonation is always floaty and fuzzy all the time. If you aim sharp on something, it's a lot less likely generally to register as off than something that is a hair flat, which is why 19-tone is a really, really weird tuning system, actually, because everything is so flat. It's technically right in the diatonic scale and where our ears should be, but it's got this sense of like,
it's just not quite there. You know, it's like, it just needs to be a little bit more, just a little bit more, and then it would be there, right? When in reality, it's like, it's perfect the way that it is, you know, it's like it exists, and it's like, that's the way that it's supposed to be, you know, but to our ears, it doesn't sound quite right.
Yeah.
which is
You
part,
could
part yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that's part of this whole, like, we've been conditioned to hear this 12 tone equal tempered music as music, right? Like things that are not that just don't sound like music. I mean, yes, it's music, right? But it just doesn't sound right, right? It doesn't have that correct sound to it,
Yeah, we were going back to what we said about right notes and
Mhm.
how there's sort of a perception of how that should work. Yeah, lots of microtonal music. I think it's interesting because if you use an albitonic mode, people can tell that it is more intentional sounding. Like anything that uses a small mode is more intentional sounding than something that doesn't. But
Right.
you still have situations where people who are fairly non-musical, if they hear that and they're not really evaluating anything, I think some people still find that to sound as random as something like serialism, which is so weird to me. I don't really understand that whole mindset. Like definitely
Yeah.
something that has like a sixer mode where those notes are always used, like that will always sound less or more ordered to me than a serial landscape. But prove
Now,
me wrong.
oh yeah, right. I'm not about to do that. Now you bring up this term serialism or serial music, right? Serialized music. Yeah, right. Exactly. Like you're in a bowl of cereal. However, it's more akin to like a serial killer. Like there's an
Oh, yeah.
order to it, right? There's a process to this type of music, and even though it sounds seemingly random, like it is intentionally random, right? Like it intentionally has been randomized to be this thing, and there's a whole mathematical equation that you can set these numbers into to get all of these different basically scales, right? Or what we call tone rows for serialized music. Now, this is, as far as I understand, like after the Romantics, basically it's just the next logical step for musicians to kind of start experimenting with. Now, Debussy, I feel like Debussy, for all intents and purposes, was an atonal composer. Atonal meaning that there is not a key center, right? Now, most people will sort of hear atonal and then kind of run away screaming or think horror movie or something, right? Whereas in reality, atonal is just a bigger umbrella to describe a lot of different other systems. And atonal, all it means is that there's no tonal center. And in fact, a lot of pop music today could be considered atonal because it's so like soupy. There's no tonic chord, right? It's just this cycle that kind of keeps going around and around.
A good example of that would be I saw this really interesting video on how the Barbershop Quartet in Bioshock had arranged God Only Knows by the Beach Boys. And I totally didn't know that the God Only Knows was this song that like sparked a bunch of debate among academics because of its ambiguous key center. It flirts with being an A, D, or E. Whoa. I hear it as A because of the primacy of A coming in first and how the chunks work. But there's I think lots of people hear tonality differently, and tonality can really be thought of as a sum of many different factors that all converge. So if you start to tease apart those factors, the whole thing sort of breaks down.
Right.
So that's a really, really good example.
Yeah. And so one thing that you just mentioned that everyone sort of perceives tonality a little bit differently. I think that's probably one of like the biggest tenets of modern music is that people started to realize that, not everyone perceives the same sounds, right? So like, for instance, Berlioz he's like mid-romantic essentially. And he's experimenting with like special effects, right? He's using them in a tonal way, but he's experimenting with sounds, And I think that's one of the earliest examples that I know of, at least, that someone is experimenting with sounds that these instruments can create. And, it kind of starts off as how do we use these sounds in a tonal sense, right? And then by the time sort of Debussy comes along, he's thinking of just sounds in the sense of like, how does it fit the story, the theme of the piece? How do these sounds all kind of work, right? One of the pieces that I show my class is the Sunken Cathedral. And like, basically the story of that is that there's this cathedral at the bottom of the ocean, and that as the tide rises and lowers, it's almost like the cathedral is rising out of the water as the tide lowers, right? But as the water lowers, these bells at the cathedral start to ring. And so like the whole piece is trying to just give this image of this cathedral rising out of the water, basically. And he's not like, Debussy isn't using like a tonal scheme, right? It's like this sound represents the bells. This sound represents the water rising and lowering, right? And he's using different sounds to represent different ideas. And there isn't like a key center, right? And then along comes Schoenberg. And Schoenberg is kind of like, well, you know what? Maybe the key center doesn't matter. You know what does matter? The theme, right? The theme and like the form of a piece really matters, right? So it's almost like you know, Debussy is kind of trying to push music into a new era, right? And like all the French, that they seem to be really concerned with the way it sounds, right? How does it sound? And if it doesn't sound good, then it's probably not good, right? But Schoenberg, on the other hand, is kind of like, in a way, Schoenberg is like more conservative than like his contemporaries, because he is, like, well, I mean, he loved Brahms and Beethoven, right? Brahms and Beethoven were like his heroes, you know? So, I mean, clearly he's going to be a conservative composer. However, he's thinking about music in vastly different terms, right? First off, he's thinking in terms of theme, right? A lot like Wagner kind of was. Like Wagner is thinking of these like motives, these little motivic ideas or leitmotifs, right? And each of these leitmotifs just signifies a different thing in the action of the story. And in a way, Schoenberg, I feel like he takes those ideas, but he decides that, you know, each of these little motives or motifs, they're just built of a collection of notes. And all those notes are just intervals, right? So what if we just take those intervals, not so much the notes, but the intervals that make up those notes? And what if we just start moving those intervals around, right? And then they kind of get to this point where it's like they realize that it feels complete once you've used all 12 notes. And then you just kind of do a different order of those notes, right? And that's how they start to serialize this music.
Right.
Now, what are your thoughts on serialized music or atonality in general?
Well, I like the idea of serial music, and I feel like there are so many ways to tease the individual compositional methods apart that it doesn't necessarily have to be shoehorned into being like frightening or inaccessible. For example, it's commonly cited that Berg would use 12-tone rows to create things like harmonies and thirds. So I think a lot of those strategies can be used in a lot of different ways, and it doesn't necessarily have to go one way or the other. Similarly, atonality gets a bad rap for being something that it fundamentally is not thought to be. And tonality and atonality occupy a broad spectrum of things. So really, I think when most people say that atonal music is something that they don't like, they really just don't like the idea of disorderly chaos and dissonance and things like that, which is something that I tend to like generally. The emotions are different, you know, all of that stuff.
The emotional content. See, to me, that it seems that the modern composers, at least the sort of early modernists, they seem to be trying to capture emotion more so with these with just these sounds, right? They're not using the tonal system anymore. They're trying to capture like images and feelings and emotions with sound. Because one of the major things I think that or one of the most important events of the 20th century is World War I, right? And World War I essentially like burns down Europe. And you know, art is always just a reflection of what's happening. And so like post World War I, these musicians and artists and writers and dancers, all they see is just this Europe that has been destroyed. It's been burned down right to the ground, and like death, just death and destruction, you know? And so music and art starts to emulate that. And like that's kind of how that's why I think Schoenberg's music and Webern and Berg, that's why it's so shocking and why it's so hard to listen to, because it truly is about this ugly, ugly subject matter, you know?
Yes. And it's the pairing of the rationality of serialism with the idea that we should be less rational after the war. And that sort of thread that was running through the second B&E school, I think is really interesting. like sociological pairing of ideas that I first became aware of from Dr. Jody Nagel from Ball State. During a presentation, he sort of talked about the whole thing, and I thought that that was pretty interesting. But yeah, I think. So, do you talk about postmodernism then, as opposed to modernism, and how those sorts of things are tied to time periods?
A little bit. So again, normally in my class, we don't really get this far. We just kind of usually we've stopped by now, but just because of the whole format of everything, you know, I figured why not? This is a cool era to talk about. Let's just include it. Cool. You know, the modernist. So the way that I've always kind of divided it in my head, and this is probably a very layman way of thinking about it, but it's like the modernists are kind of the first half of the century, and the postmodernists are the second half of the century, and like postmodern definitely encompasses a wide variety of things. I mean, so does modernism, I guess, but postmodernism has like nothing is wrong essentially when it comes to the postmodernists, and this is also post World War II. So I think that like World War I kind of shapes Europe and art in the sense of like, hey, everything burned down, life kind of sucks, and then World War II hits, and it's like, oh crap, everything burned down again, and life like really sucks now, and like it just kind of creates this weird atmosphere in art where like, well, nothing is wrong because I mean for like several reasons, you know, but you start to get this like just these strange views of composers and how they're trying to essentially just like shock the public. Right, that's kind of what postmodernism to me is. It's more of like shock value of like, you know, how can I one up this other composer? Like, how can I do this more shockingly than the last guy?
Yeah, it's interesting because modernism and postmodernism aren't very easy threads to historically analyze. And I know that when I've read about postmodernism, if you associate modernism and postmodernism with particular movements and time periods, I think they can take on different meanings than what people sometimes intend. So I would assume that in the class you're talking about, that modernism is sort of referencing maybe the time of Stravinsky, where people were breaking norms for the sake of breaking them, perhaps experimentally, perhaps for discovering new emotions, perhaps both. And then postmodernism refers to not only something that's happened after that was possible and after it became societally acceptable, but also refers to sort of a state where you can take stock of any particular aesthetic and use it. So maybe postmodernism as a term is more reflective of our polyaesthetic world and all of the different kinds of disciplines that we can draw from. And postmodernism is also generally more associated with the deconstruction of things in general, like maybe even the deconstruction of its, however paradoxical that might be, the deconstruction of modernism, the deconstruction of the past, the deconstruction of particular rhythms and pitches, you know, the deconstruction of deconstruction, what have you. It's definitely about taking ideas, I think, and teasing them apart. And there's also sort of a thread of irony and wit that can run through postmodernism, where I think it's inherently referential. So Charles Ives being ahead of the curve in that using quotation dissonantly, I think really interests me. And it's something that I want to capture in my postmodernist music. If you don't mind, the album that I'm working on, which is just a string of emoticons, is highly postmodernism or highly postmodernist in its in sort of the techniques that it uses.
Sorry, is that the name of the album? Because that's totally what it should be, just a string of emoticons, and then you just have the...
Well, I can send you the actual name, or I can put it in the comments. It's like the actual emoticons, I think, are like headphone, ear, soon arrow, pink heart, red heart, shoe, radio, person riding bike, gold medal, video game controller. I've almost got it memorized. It's like a string of like 16 or 17, and at the end there's like 2 ears. It's very recognizable. So that is the name of the album, and this is an album that is obsessed with excess for the sake of excess. And it is also poking fun at a lot of contemporary microtonal ideas. So in that sense, I think it's fairly postmodern. For one thing, like if you're in, and by the way, feel free to stop me if I get too esoteric, because I know these ideas are, a lot of my intentional subversion of these ideas in my album tracks comes from kind of like knowing the microtonal landscape and what people expect of any given composer when they're writing in a certain tuning. Like, if you're writing in a certain tuning system, I think one expectation is that you know the tuning system, at least a little bit, at least like we know 12 tone equal. So that means that tuning systems with levels are considered impractical. But there's really no reason that they have to be, since they're on the computer. So the first track is in 1200 tone equal temperament. I should have made it 1201 looking back, but there are all kinds of tricks that I use to get people to hear things that they think they hear but aren't actually hearing. Like, for example, in that first track, in the 1200 tone equal temperament track, I begin, and the first minute just uses quarter tones. So my hope is that some people will hear that and think that they're hearing more complex pitch structures than they're actually hearing. I really like implanting that expectation, just through the very nature of the material that I've created. And 1200 equal temperament is a very big amount of notes to have. So lots of people think that that's like an end game. But then at 2 other strategic ports later in the album, I use tunings that are entirely above 1,350, and I use 20 of them all in one track that's less than a minute. And then the last track is in Googleplex EDO. So all these are just silly. So there's kind of various silly threads running throughout this thing to make a mockery of the whole naming system or what the theory is defined. But yeah, do you know what a Googleplex is? I don't know if you've heard of it.
Well, I mean, I understand that. I know that it is a number. I don't know the exact value of that number, though. I mean, we used to joke about stuff like that in grade school,
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Googleplex,
Yeah, you don't have to know the exact value of a Googleplex to get the joke, because most people know that a Googleplex is a really, really big number. But what's really important about it is it's never a number where you could use a lot of the notes out of it. It's one of those gargantuan numbers that you can never think of. Like a Google is big, but a Googleplex, there's not a Googleplex number of atoms in the universe. So what I do is I just use 100 tone equal temperament, because it's still within Googleplex EDO. So it counts if we don't make a clarification in the definition of using a tuning system that specifies that we have to get the essence of the tuning system in what we're doing. See what I mean?
Yeah, right. I don't know. I think that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that, it seems that what you're working on is just it's several layers of irony here.
Right.
I personally think that irony and sarcasm. Those are 20th and 21st century forms of high art, I love it, man. It's sort of like memes, memes are kind of this 21st century form of high art,
Right. It's weird. Yeah. And it's definitely it's really steeped in meme humor, the whole thing. The meme being just this excess that no one ever needs.
And the fact that you just have the title of the album is just a bunch of memetic emoticons,
Right, and there's something even better that happens, is that the individual track titles begin with the tuning system used, and then a string of 96,000 emoticons that I've carefully constructed in different patterns, so that when you scroll through each track, it's very, very entertaining to watch the pattern change. I checked, and Bandcamp can do it, so that's another
That's
part.
funny. Yeah. That's hilarious, man. I love it.
The best part is we haven't even talked about what the music is. It's just straight up EDM, but sometimes really dissonant, and the rhythm is also really, really insane. I'm also doing things where if I have a bar of maybe 25 eighth notes that's really tiny, I split it up in a certain way, and then the next part I split it up in a slightly different way. That is just everywhere in this album. I was also interested in exploring the boundaries between extra tone and pitch, and what kinds of things count as being in tuning systems or not. So the longest track on the album, I mentioned that the shortest track on the album was in 1,350, 1,750, 2,460, blah, 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 blah. A bunch of people, 20 of them. And the last one was 198,000 or something, EDO. And then the longest track is in 0 EDO, and it's 21 minutes long. And 0
does it even have any notes? What does that even mean? So okay, first off, for my class, EDO, this term means equal divisions of an octave, right?
Yeah, and so over here where we had 19 EDO. I can illustrate that really quickly. 19 notes in an octave instead of 12.
Right. So Now, I'm curious, zero EDO. So there's only one note, or like,
It's
what is
funny
it?
because I had always assumed that there would be one note that you would start as a reference pitch, and that actually is a mathematical definition. But depending on the dimensionality of what you're talking about, I always thought that having no notes would be like null set EDO. But when some people say zero EDO, they mean having literally no notes to speak of. Zero EDO, as far as I was concerned when I made that track, is you have one reference pitch that's arbitrary and all of the notes are undefined.
Oh, whoa.
Which means that they don't exist. So I just use one note, and it's something like a B, but then I play with various notions about how this can count as just being one note. So pitch doesn't appear until like halfway through the track and like 9 minutes in. The rest of it is just rhythm. So the hope is that maybe some of the people who think that it's a different definition think that there's going to be no notes in this at all and just rhythms. And then all of a sudden there's this big note that's crazy and it's all just B. But it's out of tune. It's out of tune. It's wavering a bit on purpose.
Yeah.
Not enough to be like out of the pocket, but enough that somebody might get upset, which is great. So
yeah, right.
Yeah, I tried my best. Yeah.
That last little bit that you said, just out of tune enough that someone might get upset, right?
Right.
Like that is a big part of just 20th century and like modern music. Just this idea that like it doesn't matter how good or bad it sounds, right? Those are just constructs, right? That doesn't matter. What matters is does it make someone feel something, right? Like does it make you feel pleasant? Does it make you feel angry? Does it make you feel sad, right? It just seems that all of these new modernist techniques all kind of come down to, does it make you feel something? I had a composition teacher tell me one time that the worst bit of criticism that you can get from a piece of music is like, yeah, that was okay.
Oh yeah.
Like
devastating.
Right. That's terrible. Like tell me, like, did you like it or not? And like, if you didn't like it, tell me, like, I want to know, like, why didn't you like it? I find that more interesting than people who like enjoy my music and, oh, this is why I enjoyed it. And it's like, okay, great. That's why I enjoy it too. Awesome. Like, I want to know why you didn't like it, like, why did it make you hate this piece of music? Like if I feel like if I can make you like truly hate something, then I have succeeded as a composer.
Very inspiring. Yeah, I feel similarly. I feel like lots of times if people criticize my music, there have been a couple of criticisms I've gotten that have been really helpful in like kind of shaping my path. But usually a criticism is just a compliment where the person who has criticized my music agrees with something that I'm doing, but subjectively they just find it bad.
Right.
Like this piece made me feel like all of the instruments didn't belong together. And I was like, good. You could have just read the program notes to get that. But I'm glad you actually heard it in the music. Maybe they had
right.
Maybe they were cheating.
Right.
Yeah.
That kind of brings up a whole other thing about program notes. I personally, I think program notes are kind of like cheating. I feel like, so this might be very controversial, but I think that program notes are they were kind of a way to get the audience into programmatic music that just wasn't very good in like the Romantic era, because it's like,
I love it.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, it's like the program note just gives it all away. It's like it gives everything about the piece away, right? Especially if it's a programmatic piece of music. It's like, great, here's what this is about. And it's like it has this really evocative title, and then it has this evocative program note. And so you read that, and then you listen to the piece, and you're like, oh, this is an evocative piece of music, right? But it's like if you take those two things away and then listen to the music, then like it's just a piece of music, like it's a thing, right?
Yeah, separating these kinds of things is definitely I think a hallmark of postmodernism, and it's also something that I'm deeply interested in my album, because we've talked about all this hilarious tuning nonsense, right? But that almost has nothing to do with what you're hearing. So I was very interested in coming up with situations where just by naming the piece in a certain tuning or other, I would get people to think false information about what would happen and then just present them something that completely isn't like that at all. For example, like, the act of using a tuning can be very short. So like, I have a few tracks that are like all of the 11 note moment of symmetry modes, which is like 15 different unequal modes or something, and all strings of 7 large steps and 3 small steps. There's only 12 strings, but that's still 12 different things. So in those pieces, I sometimes would have situations where maybe I used like, if I had 12 modes to use, I would use like 7 of them, in a big way, and then the other 5 would just get like a little blip of like one instrument using it briefly, you know? Things like that.
Yeah.
So it's
awesome.
not this binary situation, using a tuning or not using a tuning. I don't think it's a binary situation, and it comes from the music and what you hear from that. So this album is kind of an exploration of how I can destroy those definitions and how I can instill false expectations in the listener. And the best part is, you don't have to know any of that to listen to the album and just be like, oh, this is really weird EDM. That's the hope. And some of them are named funny, like where they're very non-specific, like track 4 is just called My Girlfriend's Hairdryer. So I just took samples from that, and yeah, exactly.
Like, tuned them.
Yeah, it's
that's beautiful.
Because the hairdryer, like, you're lucky because, like, if you've got the hairdryer, well, if I've got it, it's just this little thing where it's like, and then if you change the switch, it goes, and it's just 3 little microtones, and then you set it to another spot, and it's like a fourth away, but you still basically got the 3 little microtones. In fact, I don't even think it's a perfect fourth. So I was just using that and then retuning various samples to various things. So in that, I used 48 EDO, 5 EDO, and 7 EDO, and a little 12 actually.
I wonder what happens if you take that sound and like speed it up and slow it down as well.
Oh, it's very, very cool. When you slow it down, you get like this awesome soundscape, which I use in the track. When you speed it up, you get something that's a little bit more grainy, which I didn't use in the track as much, just because I had used grainy sounds in another track. This is actually something that I wanted to talk about in the 0 EDO track. Rhythms counting as notes if they're sped up enough. It's been talked about, ad nauseum, where like if you're thinking about hertz as representing a pitch, then you can think about a rhythm that's sped up imperceptibly to take on a pitch value, and you can do that with a computer.
Yeah.
So in the first part of the 0 EDO track, I have a very complicated polyrhythmic beat that like lines up after 2 million beats. That never gets there. And I speed it up in a certain way so you get this kind of noise happen. And it's just, and then I stop it, and then it's like, this might count as a note, So,
right. Am I playing another note? That's funny.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it's not 0 EDO anymore. But technically, you get me.
Now, so one of the things that I want to get out of this, I gotta wrap it up here in a few minutes. But one of the things that I really want to get out of this is that, okay, so I think like your album is actually a perfect example of this sort of these modern ideas, right? Because
I was hoping so.
We are no longer thinking in terms of like tonality, right? It's like, here is this sound, right? How can I manipulate this sound to create a pattern of sounds that is accessible in some way, right? And like it's just these concepts are so much more prevalent in modern music than any other era before them. Like in the Baroque era, you kind of get like the Four Seasons from Vivaldi, for instance. It's like, okay, how can I make like bird sounds? Okay, we can kind of play this little motive, and you do it long enough, it kind of sounds like birds, right? How can I get thunder? Things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas today, it's like, I kind of don't even care about the actual pitch, right? If I want birds, I'll go and record birds, and then like do all these processes to this bird sound to create all of these crazy other types of bird sounds, And
or synthesize a bird sound, or get a bird sound that is not really a bird sound, or mix bird sound and pitch, or extract pitch information from bird sound.
Right. And there's so many other just ways of looking at this. Well, I think part of this too is technology, right? We have now gotten to this point with technology where we can take a sample of a sound, right, and like really pull it apart and see, it's like, well, what frequencies exist in this sound, and like, why does this matter? We talked about spectralism way kind of a little earlier, and one of the ideas of spectralism is just looking at frequencies of sounds and seeing like how much frequency exists in a sound, and sort of taking like the extremes of those frequencies and utilizing those in some way. So one of the, I guess, the greatest tenets of modern music is the fact that it just can't be like what came before it. It has to be different, right? And that seems to be sort of the modern view of things, is like, it just has to be different.
Yeah, and it's so tied to what time period it is considered
Right.
to represent. Like I've heard a lot of people say that like if you write music now that is sort of in the European tradition, that it's kind of like considered pastiche almost because of the new possibilities that you have, or old fashioned. But then if you write something that sounds like pop music, people don't usually get those kinds of insults because there's lots of pop music happening all the time and it's being enforced by popular demand.
Right.
Whereas older European music, although very well known, I would say doesn't get that level of hype as like people going to a music festival or something like that.
Yeah, right. I see that, man.
So a lot of it is about what the people want.
Yeah, that's a big deal, actually. Like, what do the people actually want?
Right.
So, I guess just to kind of wrap this up, any closing thoughts you have, kind of on modern music?
Let's see. Well, let's see. I'm trying to think because there's a lot of things
Yeah.
that we could say.
I know. There's a lot of things that we didn't say either.
I would say it's interesting to think about what the next revolution will be technologically, because now that we've had computers, I suspect that the next crazy discovery will have to do with how consciousness operates. So probably after that happens, music will change again in ways we could never have explained initially.
That actually kind of reminds me. There's this sort of music psychologist, I guess. Her name is Elizabeth Margulis, I think. I don't know what she would sort of define herself as, but she has this book called On Repeat, and it's kind of talking. Yeah, it's a really interesting book. I haven't read it all the way, but the basic gist of it is, it's how your brain perceives like repetitions in music, or how a non-musician perceives music, basically, and just they do a lot of experiments with like repetition and kind of how humans latch on to repeating ideas and stuff. And it's really interesting though, and I think that like the psychology of music is kind of the next big field. Music therapy, I think, has a lot to do with that as well. Music therapy is quickly becoming a very recognized field in the music academia.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Absolutely.
Well, Stephen, as always, it was a very interesting chat, man. I always learn something.
That's cool. Yeah, it's great talking to you as well. Really appreciate you me having me on for the class.
Yeah, man, definitely. All right, well, class, as always, goodbye. I will see you in the next video.
Cool.
And YouTube. We're still on YouTube for a second. I'm going to stop this live stream. Goodbye.